Cultural Forum, which has the pleasure to host, I think, very interesting workshop today. This workshop is the first in a series of workshops devoted to gaming, and the workshop will be led by Benjamin Hanussek,
Hey.
who is the co-initiator of the PJAIT Game Lab and is a lecturer at the Polish-Japanese Academy of Computer Science. And let me also mention that the other partner of today's event is the Perspective Women in Tech, which is a foundation that hosts an annual event, Perspective Women in Tech Congress, which is going to take place in June. And I encourage you to stay tuned, because it's a great meeting, a great gathering of tech experts, tech enthusiasts, mostly women, and this is the biggest event of this kind in this part of Europe, so stay tuned. There will be an opportunity to get free tickets for the Congress. Get in touch with me or with the Perspective Women in Tech. And now a voice over to Benjamin.
All right, thank you very much. All right, so first of all, thank you very much for coming here to our Rethinking Games series, which is going to launch today. So obviously we are here today to discuss games, specifically what is a game and why do we play. But in order to approach this more, well, in a more systematic way, as we will be getting quite philosophical, I'll first present you the agenda for today. So we'll have an introduction to the general concept of that. I'll introduce you to me. Obviously, most of you don't know me, and you don't want to have some person that you don't know talking to you for 90 minutes. And then we'll be talking about, or rather straight in jumping to the question, what a game is. This will be a highly interactive session, so yeah, well, you will be getting your chance to voice your opinions or perspectives on games. We'll then go over to on the difference between games and play, and go over to why we actually play. Then we'll conclude and have then time for a bit of questions and answers. All right, so first to me. So, hi, I'm Benjamin. First name basis is how I play, and just so that you know what entitles me to speak here today about games in a professional manner, I drew this very simplistic timeline, just show you where I'm coming from. So I started actually my professional career in games or in games research at the University of Warsaw as an archaeologist when I got engaged into the movement of archaeogaming. It's basically a bunch of researchers that try to connect video games and their historical and archaeological merit. So I've been involved into some projects, writing papers, but eventually I thought, I just want to deal with games. I don't want to limit myself to archaeology, and I got a degree in game studies and engineering in Austria at the University of Klagenfurt, where I then started to get more engaged and specialized in the areas of game-based learning, game design, and games user research. So I had the opportunity to get a fellowship by the Marshall Plan Foundation in Austria and travel to Columbia University in the US and do a project on game-based learning. And this is also the time where I got in touch with the Polish-Japanese Academy and started already teaching there last year. Eventually then I founded the Game Lab, which I will be mentioning in a while. And well, when I came back from the US, I had two possibilities. I could have go on and do a PhD in games, but at that time I actually thought I would like to deal more hands-on with games, and I decided to become a games tester, which I'm still here. There are some colleagues from work, great to have you here, and still a decision that I do not regret at all. All right, just by the way, if you want to connect, you can find me on LinkedIn, and if you're interested in what I did during these 6 years, then you can look up my research. All right, so where does this put me? Pretty much there. This is like where I am. I'm in between the industry and academia. This is where I see the most potential for video games in both realms. If we go too much into the industry and focus too much on production, all what we get is a bunch of games that might have no soul. If we go too much into the academic realm, we'll be just moralizing about games and excluding more liberal approaches to video games. So I pretty much like the sweet spot between academia, so teaching at the university, doing research, and working in production in the sector of quality assurance. So eventually, Marta contacted me and said it would be great actually to start a little project. So we came up with the idea of this workshop series to discuss games in an accessible manner, which means that obviously you don't need to code anything here. You don't need to have hands-on development experience. We'll be just discussing about games, but we still wanted to give you guys something that you can take home with you, meaning that we might be able to challenge the views that you have on games, as we will be discussing this from a vast cultural perspective. And yeah, so why Rethinking Games? This was the idea for the workshop series, is that much of what we think about games is simply outdated. Whether you're a professional or you hate games or you're totally indifferent. What you know about games is most likely outdated and comes like from media reports you saw in the late 90s or the 2000s. And this series can help you to understand games from new perspective and maybe even inspire you to consider games as a reasonable hobby, maybe consider games as a reasonable career path, or even if you're already into games, you can basically just find new perspectives.
Short question, will you put this somewhere on YouTube?
Yes, yes, okay. It will be there, absolutely. Otherwise we wouldn't do the effort, right? Okay, so, and yeah, if you are already a developer, sessions like these may even help you to challenge your views. So, our Rethinking Games series will have 4 episodes. So today we have what is a game and why do we play. Then we'll be talking about a history of video games. Then we will be discussing whether games are art or not. And then going in whether games are good or bad. But obviously I won't go into these other 3 topics, as today we will focus on what games are and why we play. All right. As I said before, this is going to be highly interactive. I'm not a big fan of lectures, and if you came here to have a dynamic discussion and participate, you're in the right spot. Of course, if you're not interested, you can opt out and be on Instagram or somewhere else. But yeah, we'll be discussing together and try to kind of synchronize our shared perspectives on video games. Okay, so we'll start with the first basic question. This is like a recurring question in games research, and it's riddled and no one has a clear answer. And that is pretty much what I'll be asking you. So my question to you, what is a game? What pops up in your head? It's not about right or wrong, but basically what would you say is a game?
So in a nutshell, I would define it as a product whose main objective is to entertain.
Okay, so entertain. A game is basically a piece of entertainment. Okay? Any other perspectives?
Something you do together.
Okay, so this multiplayer social aspect, great. Yes, competition is also a recurring topic around games. Also something that's being challenged nowadays, but this might be a topic for a different session. Anyone else? Storytelling, narrative. Great. So we can find all of these. Yes, please.
Looking for the child.
Okay. All right. So reconnecting with an activity you used to do. Great. So it's like a portal, or almost like a time machine. Great. So there are many games that we associate, many things that we associate with games, but still kind of, you know, if you think about it, how can all of these aspects be merged in one thing? Like, those are our associations, but is it really what a game is? Well, let's maybe look at a couple of cases. This is a pretty straightforward one. So how many of you guys know chess? Just knowing it. Okay, pretty much everyone. How many of you have played chess? Okay, pretty much also everyone. Great, so I guess I chose the right case for that one. So chess is a turn-based strategy game for 2 players where the goal is to defeat the other player by moving the figures, right? So keep that in mind. Chess will be, at least for some time, a case that we'll be looking at. The next game is this one. How many know Tetris? Great, everyone. So how many of you have played Tetris? Okay, also everyone. It's getting better. Can someone explain to you what kind of game Tetris is? Yes?
You have to fit all the blocks into the right place before the time runs out.
Absolutely right. That's the goal of Tetris. You have to form these lines in order to, it's simply like a puzzle, right? You need to fit in brackets and solve a puzzle while you're challenged by time. All right, so we have two games. And now in order to kind of like think about why we intuitively think of both of these as games, what do these two games have in common? Take your time, but if you got something, let me know.
Things do not happen simultaneously.
Okay, okay.
So it's not like there's one is drawing and here one piece comes down. But it's not several pieces coming down at the same time or several figures getting drawn at the same time.
Well, I mean, I still play Tetris, and I must say sometimes a lot of them come at the same time. But I get it. Like obviously there is this aspect of that things are happening, yes, at a step. Especially in Tetris, this is not flowing down. At least in the classic one, it's coming down step by step. Any other things that these games have in common? Yes.
Really that you have to use the logic to come up with the strategies to win or to keep playing.
All right. So you need to master both games, obviously, right? Okay. Maybe one more thing that these games might have in common? Not that easy, actually, right?
There are blocks.
There are blocks. Great tiles. Tiles define pretty much the game space. Okay. So, okay, these things they have in common, but I don't have the feeling that this actually helps us really, right? In trying to figure out what a game is. So what do these games, how do these games differ? Are there like elements that are like profoundly different, even though we would call both a game? Yes?
In normal text, in the original, for example, it's only a single player game. But in chess, you need two people in order to.
So this is a multiplayer, this is a single player. All right. And both can be games, obviously, right? Okay, great.
You could say the one is also more popular in a real world, and the other one is more popular as an electronic game.
Okay, yeah, this.
Possible,
Well, this could be all. Yeah, this is probably true, though I'm pretty sure that chess.com has a lot of players, including me. But yeah, technically it's right, and it's already pointing in the direction that obviously both games happen in some different form of materiality. This is virtually born, this is materially born, and hundreds, almost, yeah, the thousands of years old. Okay, so here are a couple of things. You basically mentioned already two things in how these games differ. So the one is a board game, the other is a video game. This is like pretty obvious. This already shows like that there might be something in terms of technology that can change games and the experience that we can expect from them. The other is that the one is a multiplayer and the other is a single player, right? And the other is that chess has an obvious end while you can play Tetris, well, basically forever. But the problem is with our approach that I think that we still have not really figured out what games really is, because it's like, you know, the more you kind of like go into the depths of trying to differ and compare, it's kind of like, okay, imagine we would bring in now more games. Things would become more and more complicated. But luckily, there's been a couple of people who've been researching games for hundreds of years. So therefore, we can draw a bit on their theories and kind of consider them when thinking about video games. And I brought you today four pretty famous or like iconic definitions of games that are used in games research, basically to discuss and approach games. And trust me, I have made them as short as possible so that you don't have to read too much. All right, there we go. And I'll just read them out to you, and then we will be starting to actually work with these definitions. So one definition by Johann Huizinga, who is a historian, a Dutch historian from the 1930s, at least this is when he wrote this book, Homo Ludens. He says that games construct a magic circle which separates the game from the outside world. This is also like a recurring discussion in games research, whether games are defined by the fact that they are separated from the real world. That this is basically what maintains the game space, is that they happen in a different world. Okay, so then we have Henry Jenkins, who's a media scholar, wrote the famous book Convergence Culture, and is also a games researcher, and he had a more artsy approach, saying that games are a lively art of the digital age, probably also more referring to video games, which is also an interesting approach, basically just showing that video games are some form of artistic expression that is significant or specific for the age that we're living in. Then we have this definition here by Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman, who are educators and game designers, and they said that in games, players engage in artificial conflict defined by rules that results in a quantifiable outcome. Obviously, this is already a way more straightforward approach. These are game designers themselves, so this is maybe where they're coming from, seeing it already like in a quantifiable fashion. And this last definition is from Sid Meier. Does anyone know Sid Meier? Right? What did Sid Meier do? Yeah. Pirates, right. No, but also Civilization, famous for the turn-based strategy game Civilization. And he said that a game is a series of interesting choices. Now it's your turn to look at these definitions and let me know which one of them you find most convincing or something that you would use. Jenkins, so games are a lively art. Why?
Well, in cooperation with the other three, I think it's like, well, it doesn't define what a video game is, but what actually it does. So I really like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it has like pretty much, it's pretty open-ended, right? It's like, it says that games are art, but what they exactly is like...
Maybe it's because we also work in the video game industry, I call them art, maybe it's like my heart, but I like that.
I tend to agree with that, but I will not put myself here too much into the front line. Any other thoughts on these definitions? Maybe there's also a definition you find ridiculous and that you would reject immediately.
From my point of view, my favorite probably is the Huizinga,
Mm-hmm.
because of the understanding of the human being in a point of view of the Homo ludens,
Mm-hmm.
so like in more in an historical
Mm-hmm.
way and understanding of the human as
Mm-hmm.
a player.
Mm-hmm. That's great. It already shows that you actually read the book, because, or at least like knows what in the book happens. It basically describes us Homo sapiens as Homo ludens, so beings that play. And in this book is this theory about the magic circle that we create like these things. All right. Okay. So the next step that we will do, as this is a workshop, and you guys got to work a bit at least with me, is that we will take, or rather you guys will pick your definition that you prefer and keep it in your mind. It will be written later on, so you don't need to memorize it too hard, but you will use that definition to analyze the game that pretty much all of you probably know. I hope so. Yeah. I think I don't need to ask about that, but well, anyway, just to refresh your memory, we'll have a look at the first level of Super Mario Brothers from 1985. All right, I think that's enough. I guess we all would like to rather play than just watch now, but well, we got to work, unfortunately. So what you just saw is the first level of Super Mario Brothers, and our goal will be now to kind of use these theories that we looked at briefly, maybe even think about how we approach Tetris and chess, and kind of like make sense out of this game. We'll go like step by step, and look at these theories and try to see the game out of these lenses. So, starting with Hausinger's magic circle. Would you say that Super Mario, or rather that Super Mario as a game applies, or rather corresponds to the theory of the magic circle?
Well, no, I mean, you're fighting against enemies who doesn't exist, so
Okay.
it's something, it's fiction, so it's like not magic, but a magic world.
Mm.
It's kind of.
I
Okay.
think also that the magic circle in the term of immersion, right?
Mm-hmm.
The player gets very immersive into
Mhm.
the game enough to get lost at one point of the reality that is around him.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I have a doubt that maybe with the evolution in the history of the video games, nowadays the magic circle, I don't, maybe the word is not important, but it is like, it can be deeper than in that era, in a video game of that era, because of the immersion.
Okay.
Today you play, for example, Death Stranding or whatever the video game is, that all the content of the video game will make you get more immersed on
Mm-hmm.
than, for example, this game, that maybe the immersive experience would be different.
I mean, I'm pretty sure that people who grew up with that game will tell you that it was probably as immersive as Death Stranding is for us today, probably. But yeah, immersion is a difficult word, obviously, but I think in this sense you mean falling into the game, having the feeling that you're there, being immersed in the game. Being basically immersed into another world. Is someone who would disagree with the fact that while playing Super Mario, we're basically entering a world that is different, that is completely separated from our world? Has any one of you ever seen someone wearing Super Mario merchandise? Yes, right? Like, so it seems that some aspects are kind of creeping out of the game. Like, obviously, we're talking at the Austrian Cultural Forum about Super Mario without playing it. So I think the magic circle might be more, opaque or, like kind of diffusive, that you can go through it or that things fall out of there. It seems not to be that strict. I mean, like, the magic circle helps pretty much in kind of like setting our mind for, okay, we're looking now at a game, we're analyzing a game, and this is happening there, and I'm here, and so on. But somehow, I would say it's more complicated than that. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time for so much complication, but the thing is that it's a definitely useful theory, but, well, looking at this aspect of merchandising or that fan culture is happening also at the same time, maybe this game is not just staying within its own boundaries. Could be. All right. Artificial conflict. There was this theory by Salin and Zimmerman which says that games are artificial conflict, they're governed by rules, and they have quantifiable outcomes. Would you say that this applies to Super Mario?
Yes. Technically, yes. You would not jump on the heads of other people in the real world. There's a counter for the points.
Mm-hmm.
And the rules are like how high you can jump,
Mm-hmm.
or how fast you can run, or what happens if you fall down,
Mm-hmm.
the gap in the ground, they're all defined.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely true. It has rules, right? There would be the mechanics also, like what you can do in the game. It has a quantifiable outcome measured by the score. And I think there is some conflict in there. And and Salin and Zimmerman, with conflict, they mean pretty much everything that contradicts you as a player in your gameplay. So everything that poses an obstacle, even if it's just a platform that you need to traverse, is already a conflict for the player, which I think is like a very useful theory. However, obviously there are other approaches to it. Would someone disagree with that? Maybe even you can come up with a game that doesn't apply to the theory of artificial conflict.
Actually, I do not agree with this
Mhm.
definition, but
But why don't you agree with the definition?
it's too shallow.
Okay, so it's, yeah.
We can
Mm-hmm.
When you're stopping on the light
Mm-hmm.
in the car,
Mm-hmm.
you have a conflict because there is a red, yellow, and green light.
Mm-hmm.
You have a conflict. The outcome is quite obvious.
Mm-hmm.
Will do. So this, for me, this definition, I know this definition is too shallow.
Mm-hmm.
I will not.
No, it's all good. Like, we're basically here to discuss that, and this is a very good, it's a good perspective to talk about here, because obviously the question is like, from which angle do we want to see games or regard games? Are those basically just, machines that we interact with, that make us feel good because we achieved something by reaching like high scores, by engaging with mechanics? And then I can think about games like Minecraft, so basically a game where you have an editor mode where you freely build, where there's not that much conflict. You're basically just focusing on building stuff. Still, you could argue that it's governed by rules because it's all written in the code, but I think this is a rabbit hole we're not going to go in today. But yeah, so obviously you can look at these theories from different perspectives, but the more we're going to go through, the more important it's to understand that we will never be able to encompass the totality of video games by just looking at them with one theory. It's basically what philosophers have been trying to do for the last 2,000 years, finding like this grand theory that will make everything, make sense. So going to the next theory, the lively art. So basically that games are the lively art of the digital era. Anyone would agree with Super Mario, or would someone disagree with that?
Well, the fact of taking some bits and put it all together and make something like this, for me, it's like that.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
It has not. I mean, it hasn't been easy for sure. And I mean, with those computers in those years, to make something like that,
Mm-hmm.
for me, it's yes.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think that it is also connected with the magic we call again, because it is pixel art,
Mm-hmm.
and that is a theory of the theory of the Gestalt in psychology, that from the point of view of the pixel art, the magic point in this lively art, and how immersed can get the player when
Mm-hmm.
playing this, is that you are playing this and at the same time your brain will be feeling all the missing art
Mm-hmm.
that you are watching in the while you are playing. For example, you can see a few bits that are representing a small character with a red hat and this dress. Then in your mind you will recreate it more realistic. Also the entire landscape.
Mm-hmm.
The mushroom, the enemy, the rocks, all of this, the player will recreate it in his mind as a complete. It's usually that the brain will feel all the missing points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this makes obviously a lot of sense, like especially for 8-bit games and everything that uses like simplified representation or rather stylized simplifications. So the goal obviously is, and we're going to talk about that a bit later on when we will going more into the psychology, is that obviously you want to create a game where your player doesn't need to think that much, right? So you need to quickly find things. The game needs to communicate extremely efficiently with the player, and this is an art form. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. That pixel art itself is an artistic practice. So besides the question of art with a capital A, it's an obvious artistic practice that is done by artists. So this comes in here. So does anyone think that eventually Mario Kart would be disqualified to be, I don't know, exhibited in the Metropolitan Museum of Art or somewhere else? Okay, probably because everyone in this room is kind of, let's say, enthusiastic about games, but what is about the capitalist aspect of that game? Doesn't it kind of like ruin the art aspect that this game was mass-produced to be sold, and probably there wouldn't have been like a lot of coders doing that in their free time in the 80s, and Nintendo. Does this contradict the aspect of art?
I don't think so at all. When you think of pop art, we had like Campbell soups and everything. I think that the painting which was reproduced by a machine and copied as many copies as the artist is art.
Yeah, so obviously
It's not a special thing, right?
it depends obviously on where we are with the art paradigm. So what do we consider art, like what art historians say and what we learn at school. Obviously that kind of influences us, but obviously this would be like the next question is like what is our definition of art in order to even judge that. But I saw Alvaro.
Yeah, but also it is important to say that nowadays the pixel art is still improving in the industry, and continuously you will see new games every year with the pixel art thematic. So there are really amazing games nowadays that they keep reaching.
And it's pretty much also, well, capitalism kind of contributes that this is even possible, but I'm not going to go into these politics here, maybe like after the session, but all right, lively art. Interesting choices. Would anyone say that Super Mario, not Mario Kart, is basically a sequence of interesting choices and this is what defines the game? Why?
Because I think the choices are rather limited in principle. You have basic blocks you can combine in different ways like actions, but there is not much else you can do. You cannot do something that's unique to you, for example. So that's why it's maybe not so much of interesting choices.
You have to go from point A to point B. No, there's no C, D, or E point.
Actually, I never tried. Can you walk to the left? You cannot, right? You cannot walk to the end of the game.
Only in the neurons.
In the original one,
No.
the screens follow you, and then you can't go back if you miss something.
Yeah, exactly.
Only in the castle, in the haunted house.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
But yeah, so this is, I would also say like, jumping itself in a virtual realm is maybe not the most, it's fun, but maybe not the most interesting choice. Though there is a bit of choice, but I think that most agree in this room that to have an interesting game doesn't mean that, it doesn't rely on only interesting choices. So sorry, Sid Meier, but it really depends again on the game, right? Because if you have played Civilization, that's pretty much a sequence of interesting choices. However, if you have ever played a late game in chess, you know that you can also play then for hours uninteresting choices of just moving one figure while the other moves the same figure and so on. So it's interesting because it seems like these theories, or some of them, seem like more essential, not necessarily apply to all game, but seem more essential than some other theories, which could be only a feature. Because I personally think that interesting choices are a cool feature of a game, but maybe do not necessarily are essential for the game itself. Okay, so great. We have analyzed Super Mario with academic theories. None of you has a degree in game design, and you already did way better than most people who have a degree. Okay, so, all right. So now we're going to make it a bit more difficult, right? To keep it a bit more interesting. So now we had chess, we had Tetris, and now we're adding in Super Mario Brothers. And we're going to ask that question again we did earlier, namely, what do these games have in common? Because we're still on searching what a game actually is.
You can win or lose.
One outcome.
I mean, with
Fun playing?
fun. Okay. They evoke emotions, obviously, these games. I'm just thinking because of Tetris, I don't know if you can actually win in the original. I think it goes on forever. But there are also Tetris versions with levels.
But you can lose.
This you can. Yeah. This is life. You can always lose, but you don't necessarily have to win, right? Okay. All right.
They have that in common, right? You can lose all of them.
Yes, this is something they have in common. So obviously, yeah, there can be like a negative feedback from the game itself, not allowing you to progress in the game. Okay. Anything else?
You need skills.
Okay, you need to acquire obviously skills on how to deal or how to handle the game. You need to learn something in order, well, we can call it skills, in order to participate in the game, to actually make some progress, to maybe win eventually. Okay. Last thing, and was actually already mentioned today, and I'm just going to ask again, is there something else that is in common?
I'm not sure how to express it, but they all have limitations. So
Okay.
there is a predefined space,
Mhm.
predefined room
Mhm.
you can engage, but you cannot, as I said, go backwards. You cannot do
Mhm.
something that is not already set from the beginning.
Mhm.
You have a fixed structure, if you want.
Mhm. Okay, which is actually goes very close into this magic circle theory, or goes a bit into that direction. We're going to reveal it now. I think it's actually going to happen after this slide, and yeah, it does. Rules and fiction. This is pretty much what all of these things have in common, and pretty much all games. And we'll talk about that in a second. I just want to make a big shout out to Jasper Jewell, who wrote that phenomenal book, Half Real, which is discussing basically the aspect of fiction and rules in video games, and brought in kind of like quite a, not a paradigm shift, but it is a paradigm basically to think of games as sets of rules that create fiction. So games are sustained by sets of rules. So for Jewell, there is no game, there are no rules. Rules is like the architecture that hold the game or the game world together. Has any one of you ever experienced a game where suddenly someone started cheating?
Yes.
Yeah.
Play a game, for example, is it?
Yeah, game.
Sure, yeah.
How did it feel for you?
For me or for him? Well, kind of. How can I say? Like.
Frustrating, maybe?
What?
Frustrating?
Yes.
Okay. I hope I didn't put that into your mouth, but anyway, so frustrating, obviously. It's like, playing a game where rules are broken is not necessarily like something that we would like to encounter, and it kind of like ruins the experience also, because you're kind of brought out of the game world because that rule doesn't apply anymore. And I think for every game tester here in the room, the moment a game is broken and doesn't work is the moment where it stops engaging you as a player. And these rules are essential in maintaining these forms of fiction. And this is really, really interesting in the book, because it says on one side that so the result of these rules is actually fiction. And if you think about it, yeah, if we go back to these games, it's like, okay, we could talk about the fiction of Super Mario, of that Italian plumber who goes to save that princess, but at the same time, why does he have only 3 lives? Like, how does that make sense in this world where there's an Italian plumber who tries to save a princess? This is where the rules bridge more or less an incoherent world and sustain it again. So rules are not just important to create that world at all, but even rules have the power in games to kind of bridge the incoherency of the world itself. And this is why rules they're like the very building block of games. Is there someone who disagrees, just by the way, and that's okay? It's like, obviously those are all theories, but if not, you might eventually, maybe, one day. Anyway, so we were talking about games, and there's something more to games, because we talked about theories about games. Games are rules, games are lively art, and so on, but do games actually exist outside of our experience? It's like, does it matter that games have been created if we're all long gone one day when the planet goes extinct and whatever? Probably not, because games are phenomenological. This is a pretty nice word you can flex on a date with, and it basically just means that it is experience-based. The discipline of phenomenology studies experience. And this means that games are not just objects that are created and then they exist, and that's a game and that's not a game, but games are basically our heads make the games work eventually through the rules and so on. And I put in images from playtesting at our game lab, where we were testing the game of another game lab of students who created that game, and we were basically doing UX testing. So we would check the games, whether they work, are they frustrating, and so on. Because if you start as a game developer, and I've developed a couple of games, you start always with thinking you know when a game is fun, you know when a game is good, and then you quickly find out that your games suck, because you do not take into account that there are other players, other people with different motivations to play that might not find your game so much interesting. So we did playtesting to take players into account in order to help other students improve their game. So games obviously require agency, external agency that is either an AI playing the game or another human being playing the game. Are there also non-human beings who play?
Cats, dogs.
Yep. Probably, I would say so too. I have a cat and she's waking me up every evening with playing ball. They play, they do. But yeah, obviously I don't know if they would understand the rules of chess. Though I just read that yesterday fish started playing Pokemon. So basically they created like a pattern and the fish would swim through the aquarium and they put like arrows for the player then to move. And eventually the fish managed to buy with the credit card of the owner something from the Nintendo eStore. So I guess fish are getting smarter and smarter every day. So understanding play as a motivated activity. So this is where we get into the midterm of this session, where we try to distinguish the difference between play and games. So is there a difference? I think probably at this point we already touched upon it, but just to refresh, would someone define play for me, or what makes it different from games?
Well, to play you have to be involved with it.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a game and that's it. But
Mm-hmm.
to play you have to be involved with it.
Okay, so obviously the game doesn't need to be involved with you, but that's a good point. Anything else?
To play, you are going to make the experiences, and the game itself, the games are all, the experience is already defined by the rules.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So a good analogy to the difference between play and games is a walk to a museum. It's like basically you have that museum, which is a building that contains works of art and what else and whatnot. And then you have play, which is basically the agency that is, or the urge, the drive of an agent to actually go into that museum and have a jolly good time, or even not. So there are obviously two things that have to interact with each other to create something that we also call in gaming gameplay, which is well, it's basically both terms just compounded, but it is not that trivial. In order to look at play in a more detailed way, we'll just have a look at that BBC News report for a second.
Now, scientists in the UK have discovered that bumblebees enjoy playing with balls just as humans and dogs do. Researchers at Queen Mary University in London say the research, which was published in the journal Animal Behaviour, provides a strong indication that insect minds are far more sophisticated than we might have imagined. Aruna Ayanga has this report.
It's an extraordinary sight. A bee plays with a ball. It's more than just cute. Researchers say this shows, for the first time, insects interacting with inanimate objects as a form of play. And that suggests their minds are more complex than we previously thought. Bees are known to work cooperatively in hives. They give us honey and wax, and our ecosystem relies on them through pollination. But despite their tiny size and brains, they're far from being just nature's workhorses. A team at Queen Mary University of London designed a series of experiments where bees rolled wooden balls. They found the bees showed their playful side without any extra inducement like a sugary treat. They went back to the toys again and again. Younger bees played more than older ones, and adult males rolled for longer than females of a similar age. Aruna Ayanga, BBC News.
And I think we can ignore our dear Prime Minister, who was there on the screen. However, and we can also ignore the fact that they mixed up bees and bumblebees. But the point is being that, and I think we can go over to the next slide. I think, wait, I can do that? Can I do that? Yeah, we can do that. All right, so play seems to be some form of urge or some form of drive, something that we do simply because we are beings. Doesn't matter if we're a cat or a bumblebee or a human, there seems to be something that drives us to playful behavior. And the question is, okay, what is play? It seems to be that drive but why do we actually engage in play? And this is now, for a moment, please do not think about games. We talked about games being rules and fiction, but obviously we saw with the bumblebees that play can exist outside of games. And my question is now, why do we play? Is there any benefit out of that?
Having fun.
Having fun. Well, what's the sense in that?
I mean, well, I don't know anyone who plays something without the point of having fun or having something to like compete with each other. Well, because you can actually you can compete and not having fun and you win, but
maybe you would also play to find something out.
So,
that object about yourself.
Oh, okay.
Because it could also be a play like an act on a stage, or children play where you have the child being mother and parents and having a child. It's also a play. So you find something about yourself and about others. It's also social interaction, I would say. You can play like a role play how to deal with situations that might come or that you dealt with.
So a form of simulation.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Obviously, this is also like what a lot of researchers think, that play is basically trying out activities in a non-harmful environment. This is what can be observed with cats when they start to kind of seem to kill each other, but they actually do not. This is a form of play.
I also think when you think about children, I would not think about babies or something like that. Really, in the beginning, I think they play with objects just to find out what is this thing and what can I do with it? What are the features? What are the uses? I think with children you see it more than with adults, that they play with things and you suddenly think, how could you have done this? Well, I played with it. And something happened that was unexpected.
Curiosity.
Curiosity, yeah.
Yeah.
Also a way of finding out what is the feature, what can this thing do I found there.
I think this is a very good example, especially with children, as we cannot really talk about motivation because there still seems to be just like an urge or a drive, curiosity or whatever, doesn't know. We cannot say if the child at that stage is aware of itself, probably not, but it's still happening. And play is first and foremost an activity, and most people describe it as a movement, right? That play is something dynamic. It's a way to engage with the world with the lack of seriosity. This is one way to look at it. Please.
And it's about getting into the flow. So it's comparable to the one aside, for example, because when you play, you get in touch with the world without time and without the room, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Like this is, there's this Hungarian psychologist with the terrible name that no one can write, Csikszentmihalyi. It sounds easier than it's written. Look it up. You will not find it if you just hear it. And he talked about flow being basically, not reducing, but seeing play as this element that sets us into motion, and then eventually aspects of games, of rules and games coming in that kind of accommodate our urge to play. So games in a way form then suddenly like a place, a platform where this urge can be kind of streamlined into direction, because we can, I can play with this, I can be bored and kind of like try to pass time by moving around or whatever. But eventually games seem like a more sophisticated version of taking this urge to play and creating like a productive, often, activity. Okay, so why do we play? Does anyone recognize this game? World of Warcraft, yeah. Obviously, World of Warcraft is probably famous, most famous, don't need to have played it to have heard about this game that sucks in the youth and lets them play for days and weeks, let them go unshowered, not attending school, not eating, nothing, just playing World of Warcraft. I've been there, it's been a lot of fun, but it's why we are bringing in World of Warcraft as an example is because Yi, a psychologist, did a major field research on hundreds of people, well, not in World of Warcraft, but pretty much all other online games. He couldn't be doing it on World of Warcraft because of privacy rights, so he basically did it on all other massive multiplayer games that were out there at that time. Ultima Online, EverQuest, probably most don't even know them, but they're pretty much all like World of Warcraft if you just look at them from an external view. To the game itself, World of Warcraft is a massive multiplayer game where hundreds, thousands of people play together. It's a role-playing game, so people acquire armors, they level up, and they do it all somehow in a virtual social platform where they also can interact with each other. And that guy, he eventually asked himself, like, so what keeps these people for hours and hours and hours and days and months engaged in this virtual world? And after that research, and I think I think it was like 300, there was a long-term study with 300 people, so quite representative, came up with a couple of elements of motivations that were recurring and are today also basis for psychological research on games. So these, there has been another factor that I left out, which is exploration. But yeah, just to keep it simple, basically. So what we have is that he found out that players would engage with massive multiplayer role-play games out of achievement. So the desire to become powerful, to achieve something, to become better. Then there's the aspect of relationship. So obviously the desire of users to interact with each other, form bonds with each other, spend time with their friends, make friends, which is, by the way, today one of the main motivations for the gaming scene to grow and grow. So if any one of you has ever heard of Discord as a platform, that might be the motivation. Immersion, so the desire to be somewhere else, to kind of go into a different world, be part of that world, to be someone else, seems to be a strong motivator. Escapism is also a strong motivator. Life sucks sometimes, and games provide then this safe space where we can interact with other people, where we can discover ourselves, and where we can just have fun and forget about our troubles in the real world. And also manipulation. This is a more of a tricky one, how inclined a user is to objectify other characters or objects, basically meaning that how much I enjoy in Tekken to beat you up. That could be, manipulation. It's a bit more complex than that, because manipulation here also involves domination, which is, if you feel that this applies to you, don't feel bad. That's okay. It's like, in any sense, in any way, these factors, would you say that only one applies per person? That there is one person that likes to objectify others, there's one person who just likes to step into another world?
No, I think these are all features most players will have. But could you once again stress a little bit more, what do you mean by, I didn't understand the manipulation. How inclined as a user is to objectify other
Yes.
characters? What's meant by that?
Yes, so this is something very common, for example, in the game Counter-Strike, where it's a highly competitive first-person shooter game, where other people step into the roles of terrorists and counter-terrorists. And in that community, people are kind of also harassing each other. It's like, it's just part of the culture. It's a very weird phenomenon, and it's fun for some, and it's a very toxic environment. This is how it's labeled. I'm not judging here, by the way, but this is, for example, this is a place where people go to fulfill that desires, to kind of, to basically defeat someone else, feel good about it, and make the other people feel bad about losing. This would be, for example, a thing. But as I said, it's a more of a tricky one. Manipulation in that sense means even like dominating your environment. So playing a strategy game and colonizing other players or defeating other players is basically, manipulation should be seen not just on the psychological level, but on the general level, like manipulating your environment. It's like more, it goes into the direction of control, trying to control the game space. So okay, so probably we might have like more traits, and probably this works also more of as a spectrum. Probably we all have like some form of desire here, but maybe some of them are more pronounced than others. And obviously, if you don't want to share right now what is the motivation that drives you, that's okay. But if you want to share which of these motivation actually drives you and want to just like try to reason on why, stage is yours. Maybe I'll do the first step and I'll just say that it really depends on the day. Sometimes I feel like I want to step into another world. Sometimes I want to dominate my environment. And sometimes I feel like I'd like to achieve something in the world, but it really depends. How about you guys? You can also use a game as an example, something that you play, that you're playing right now, or something that you have played, where you think that, yes, I can recognize myself with that form of motivation.
It depends. For example, immersion, I would relate this with other narrative games, like the Death Stranding or this kind of point and click games that you need to figure out what's happening and get more immersed in the situation. But maybe there is a little bit of manipulation in this saga that I am playing now of conquering the different. It's not civilization, but it is a similar one. I don't know honestly. It surprises me, this definition. But yeah, of course, relationship. I think nobody can play League of Legends alone.
Well,
nobody will play against the artificial intelligence. So.
When you're looking for games to play, how much do you think about your motivation to play? Like when entering the Steam store or any other form of platform where you could choose games, or even if you think about the games that you played, like how much do you think about your own motivation to play that game? Like, does it even pop up in your mind?
Well, it's more like, it depends for me, like the time I'm able to play, because if I have like half an hour, for example, it's just maybe 10 games that I can play, but if I have like 2 or 3 hours, I can go with all the different games. So maybe the motivation is, for me, it's depending on how much time can I spend.
Okay, that is a motivation I really understand. Yeah, especially as you grow older, you don't have that much time anymore, except if you're a game tester, then you might have, it's like you cannot escape playing. Yeah, okay. So these motivations obviously help us to understand why we play. This is the reason why even people study them. And also why is another reason that has strongly to do with the fact of this chart. So this is a chart of the video games industry and their market volume since 1972 till pretty recently. What can we see? What's happening? Is it getting worse? It's growing, right? It's growing. It's growing. What could be the reasons why this is growing? Money. Okay, money, but money doesn't fall off trees like over time.
Money and interest, because there are different genders.
But why are these companies doing more money?
Because technology advances through time and it opens more opportunities.
Okay, so basically also the tools and the means to produce games are getting cheaper, which from an industrial standpoint is absolutely false, because games are just getting more and more expensive to produce. But still, there seems to be a reason why this is constantly growing. It might even has to do with the previous slide, like talking about player motivations. Yes, please.
I would not agree there. 30 years ago, you were paying the same amount of money for the AAA game like you are paying like that right now. Despite of the rising costs of the producing of the game and the technology and everything
Okay.
You said that the costs are growing. So
Yeah, I mean, like the costs are growing, but I have not.
the customer is not paying.
Yeah, the customer is not paying, but
Actually, the customer is paying the lower price.
yeah, absolutely.
He was paying 30 years ago.
Because in order to make it viable for Ubisoft to to sell Assassin's Creed, a unit should cost 200 euros, but obviously no one's going to pay that. But there seems to be a reason, and one of the reasons is obviously that the player base is growing and growing and growing. So more people today. Does anyone have an idea how many people play video games, including mobile games? I know some people don't consider mobile games video games, but let's include mobile games. Any idea? There would be already here, like there, but almost. We're at 3 billion active players. Obviously, it's very easy to track how many people are playing video games because it's all happening online. And if it's not happening online, there's a company that's nevertheless going to extract your data. So yeah, it's about 3 billion. That used to be here around 1 billion, 1.5 billion. So this grew, and this has a lot to do with this. Because developers have become more aware about the motivations of players, and games are, at least on an industrial level, not anymore designed because there is someone with a vision and wants to create a game, but simply because developers have become more aware of their demographics and more about target groups. So, which means that these player motivations that somehow exist, because we seem to have them, are then used to inform game design. Well, they can be good in the sense that there are some, obviously if you pay 70 euros for a video game and you feel accommodated because you feel that the designer made an effort to accommodate you in that game space and your motivation, that's great. However, they can be obviously also used to make you spend a lot of money off your parents' credit card if you're buying gems on Diablo Immortal and other devilish games. So the point is that these motivations and why we play is like a double-edged sword. On one side, it helps game designers to understand how players play and what they really enjoy about games. However, these motivations can also be used to basically create video games that do the same, but in a more, exploitative fashion. And what all of these motivations have in common, and what makes them combines them more or less, is agency and meaning. So basically you have these motivations, okay, you do not necessarily need to drive or need to dominate someone, you don't need necessarily the drive to achieve something, but what all of these motivations have in common is that they connect agency and meaning. And this is something that, whether you agree or not, but I think most people agree, is something that is quite important for all of us. That we have some form of agency, so we have the feeling that what we do has an impact on the world that we're living in. So whether it's like our family, our friends, the Austrian Cultural Forum, it would be great to have like some impact, but there is necessarily a positive feeling associated with that. The other thing is meaning, because you can play Tetris because it's a rule-based game, but if it doesn't create any form of meaning, either if it's just through the score, it's like pretty pointless, because an activity that has no meaning is unenjoyable. At least, okay, there could be different examples for that too, but generally all of these motivations, so just to recap, the aspect of relationship, manipulation, achievement, escapism, and immersion, all of these aspects are driven by our need to have some form of agency, discover some form of meaning. The last theory we're going to look at for today is something that takes agency and meaning and discovers what game design actually can contribute to our perspective on life. And this is as philosophical as it will get by the game designer Jane McGonigal. It's already 12 years old, but I think all of you remember a time where suddenly gamification became a buzzword. And this was mostly because of this book. And in that book, what McGonigal basically does is that she discovers game design as something life-enhancing. It's that the basic premise is that, well, I'm going to just say it bluntly, life is meaningless and it's not fun. It's like chaotic, it's unpredictable, and most of the time it's really not a good time. And this has to do because it's chaotic. It's like we do not get direct feedback on our actions. We do not really have the feeling that we progress. So what McGonigal does is to see life through the perspective of game design and try to find a remedy. The result would be gamification and a bunch of really useless apps that track your activity and quantify it. But on the other hand, it also really helps to look at game design as not just something that is specifically useful for players, but it seems that game design applies to a distinct urge that we have, or urges, namely agency and meaning. And because game design basically creates order and meaning. If you think about, at the beginning of this talk, we talked about rules and fiction. And rules being like this form of architecture that holds the game together, or the game or the experience, and structures it. And this is what game design does. It takes a lot of elements and creates this architecture, this amazing gameplay experience by design. And McGonigal had a very severe accident, and she had like I don't know if it was a brain seizure or something like that, but she couldn't basically move for, I don't know, I think 3 or 4 months. She was just laying in the bed and starting to get depressed and so on. And what she started to do is to actually create a game that was based on recovering. So she would create like a system where she would reward herself for getting out of the bed, you know, brushing your teeth, taking a shower, like pretty simple things, and would then expand on these activities to finally find back into lives. And this is actually, it was later, I think the app still exists. I don't know the name of it, somewhere in the book, but eventually she recovered and is pretty certain that it was because of game design, basically, because she said that there would have been no way for her to ever recover from this, you know, depression if there wasn't a way to make recovering enjoyable in a way in such a situation. So pretty strong words, but I think it's quite interesting if you think about it, that the basic premise is that reality is broken. It's like, you know, and game design is in a way an approach to fix this brokenness, and that we can eventually live happier lives when we think through things with the lens of game design. You can disagree or agree with that. Those are big words. I know also my supervisor at Klagenfurt hates that book and hates for everything it stands because, why could we hate this book or disagree with this approach in making everything a game? Is there something bad about it?
Forgetting about real life? I don't know if that's an issue.
So basically, it seems to be that there seems to be a world worth living that is not necessarily fun. Or at least that. Just kidding. But no, I mean it. Is there anyone who thinks that there might be a problem in turning everything into a game? Like, is there a problem in counting your steps on your phone? Well, obviously, okay, I see that here we're pretty much a trade who probably would say that, yeah, would improve it, but I have met throughout my professional career a lot of people who have reasonable arguments why it's actually a terrible approach. It's kind of like trying to quantify everything is something that might take out the human element out there. So if we try to, let's say we take a walk only because we want to reach our 10,000 steps, might be enjoyable from a game design perspective, or at least from this play perspective, but it might destroy the experience of just walking and, you know, having like fresh air, though here in Warsaw there doesn't seem to be too much of that anyway. But so trying to quantify things all the time might be a problem, but that would only apply if you would think that game design is rule-based. And then, again, this is where the philosophies of game designers then go into different directions. Okay, so we're slowly closing the session for today and going then into a QA session. And just to recap about the things that we talked about today. So we talked about what a game is or what it's not. How do they differ? We compared Tetris with chess. We looked at Super Mario. And eventually, some of you have now a clearer idea to games. Maybe it has become more confusing, but the point is that it's not that easy. You cannot just go down there and claim that a game is that or that. It's a very, very complex affair. And this is something that might make you more aware when you play games, how games are. It can give you a new way of enjoying them because you will be more aware of elements that constitute a game. On the other hand, if you're a designer or a developer, then these perspectives can challenge your thinking and might make you more critical in your design, help you to create more progressive design strategies for your games. But generally, this discussion remains unresolved, but this is pretty much all we have to individually make out for ourselves, how we regard games. Then we talked about rules and fictions, and where I wrote seem and is not is because obviously I know that there are some people who will not agree with that statement, and that's okay. However, for me, it's like a pragmatic choice to think about games as sets of rules that create a form of fiction, simply because of the fact that I cannot work otherwise. If I think of games of anything but, and about the whole complexity of video games and what they can be and what they should be and so on, I will eventually fail to, it won't help me when I would develop games, when I design games, or when I teach games or test games. So, rules and fiction. Games are phenomenological. This is something that you should keep in mind, is that, yeah, games are objects, they are created, but they are objects created to be experienced. There is no game without a player. And this player-game loop is something that is extremely important to understand both the game and the player, so you cannot just separate them and try to study them. And, well, different players have different motivations. This is the golden rule, obviously, when you want to develop a game, because if you try to develop a game for everyone, that's difficult. And I think the most successful games that manage that is probably Uno. Yeah, it's basically a game that everyone can play and everyone can enjoy. But it's not that easy to create such an effective, simple game. In video games, it's becoming more and more difficult to find actually games that just try to do some things right. Nowadays, in video games, we have something that's called feature bombing. It's basically you have a board of consultants telling the director of the studio to include this because there are a lot of people who like that. And they should include this because there are a lot of players who like that. And eventually you have a game with a lot of features, but it's more like a patchwork. So they do a lot of things, but they do not necessarily do a lot of things right. So different players with different motivations, something that you need to keep in mind. Might be also just interesting to think about your own motivations, and it might help you to find the right game for you to play. Last takeaway, and obviously you're not forced to believe in anything what I say here, but is that this is at least the takeaway that I'm getting out of this discussion, is that games are systems or fictions that structure and accommodate our need to play. So there seems, regardless whether why we play or where does play come from and so on, there seems to be an urge that makes us play, that makes us do things that are not necessarily motivated by getting a good grade, getting a good pay, I don't know, finding a partner or whatever. There seems to be something inside of us that just wants to move and just wants to have fun or wants to be engaged in something. And games are these systems or fictions that offer like accommodation for that drive. And a good game is a game that accommodates our urge to play very well. So that's pretty much what you might have taken out of this session. Maybe you have like some own thoughts. It might help you in any case. I just hope that you had something from this session that might, stay in your mind, or will be at least an interesting talk for your next beer. And with that, are there any questions? Anything that I don't know, was on your mind for the presentation. You can also ask me something about myself and my work.
When you were talking about the motivations, I had to think about people that invest in cryptocurrency. And I was wondering if a lot of people that game these games or play these games, if they are also investing in cryptocurrencies. Because that's a very similar structure if you think about it. Most of them have no meaning, they have no utility, but people nevertheless invest and play with them. You can actually see rules that are bound, people then want to beat the rules. Do you think that gamers are very much attracted to something like crypto?
This is an interesting question, and that I love to answer because I spent some time in New York City, where before crypto crashed this last year. So you had it was very interesting to see how there was a huge exodus at Wall Street. Everyone moved into crypto, and still while I was there was this faithful interview with Bill Gates, who called basically crypto I don't know, idiot's dream, and then everything crashed, and then everyone moved back to Wall Street. And so to answer your question is that I think that crypto, that the reason why some gamers are more inclined to invest into crypto is because it's already culturally very close to each other. So you have gaming, you have IT, and all of these things, and eventually you have crypto. And there's one big crypto game called Illuvium, and it's representative for pretty much every crypto game, which is, there's a term in video gaming which is called grinding. And grinding means playing to earn, playing to get more items, to get more experience, to level up, and so on. And all of these crypto games, because they're currency based, so the more people play, the higher the currency goes up. This is one factor. The other thing is that that cryptocurrency is missionary. And I mean that people go out and try to convince as many people as possible to participate in that Ponzi scheme. So so the point is that on one side we have this aspect that gamers seem to be already in a realm that is close to IT, is close to coding, and so on. And on the other hand, you have this strong force of there's not just one person who invests into crypto, but there's also the friend who didn't want to invest but had to invest because he was manipulated. But this is only my take on crypto. Yeah. All right. Any more questions? Yes, please.
Well, first, thanks for the interesting presentation and the involving us into your development of theories and of ideas. The first question: what is a game? It seems to me a little bit like it's meant to include many things, not only video games, but also chess or other activities and so on. But from your scientific research and your experience, is there something that many people would consider a game that you would not consider a game?
Yeah, so there is a movement in gaming and game development, but also in players, which is, or it's more or less a genre. It has become our own genre, which is called a walking simulator, which are games that are 3D rendered environments where players, it's mostly like detective stories and so on. They enter in like a 3D environment, and then there's, for example, a riddle to solve, or they need to find out what's going on. There is this very famous game called Gone Home. It's like a player arrives at home, doesn't know what's going on, and then by engaging with objects, you find out what's going on. And the thing is that everyone who's playing these games, and I have also played a couple of them and I enjoy them a lot, they would consider them full-fledged games, but they obviously do not necessarily apply to a lot of strategies and theories that I, as you asked myself, engaged with, because I'm a pragmatist and I like to narrow things down to at least come out with some form of quantifiable answer. But if you think like in a more open way, it's always possible to include them. But yeah, this discussion with walking simulators is an interesting one. But yeah, if you just have like some time to Google walking simulators, you will know what I mean. But it's a pleasurable activity that I would not necessarily qualify as normative games. Yeah. Thanks.
this is a question for you. Which one would you consider the most important in a video game of the different fields? The narrative, the design, the which one would you consider the
most important? Yeah, this is also a very difficult question because game design itself is like a multi-dimensional Rubik's cube that puts in a lot of things together that have to fit with each other, and it really depends on the genre of the game which game design element should be more focused on. If we're, let's say, if I'd like to play a good Call of Duty game, probably 4 or 5, then I'm not necessarily that much interested in, the story is still good, but it's not like I'm not playing because of the story, right? I'm playing because shooting has been operationalized in the game as a very enjoyable activity, basically. You get direct feedback on what you do, and the controller vibrates, and it feels somehow enjoyable. On the other side, if you're playing a horror game, right? In a horror game where the narrative is maybe a bit more important, trying to find out, but also the aspect of trying to be a bit scared, their aspects of mechanics, so strong mechanics that empower you like in a Call of Duty game are not that important, right? Because it's not a horror game if you have a rifle, if you have grenades and so on. It's a horror game if you have nothing, basically. You cannot do anything, you can only run away. So it really depends on the game genre and what kind of game experience the developers thought to achieve with their design.
Another question?
Yes.
Today we talked about the motivation
Mm-hmm.
of the gamers, but I remember there is a kind of list of the different types of gamers also.
Mm-hmm.
Would
Yeah.
you talk about this in a new
Mm-hmm.
exhibition? Or?
So you mean basically that there are these motivations, but there are also player types?
Yeah.
Yes.
Player types.
Yes.
I don't remember well the list, but
Mm.
it's kind of explorers,
Mm-hmm.
people who play just.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember.
No.
the list.
But I definitely know what you mean because this research was done in 2005. So this is like long time ago. Things have changed a lot nowadays. Big companies, they have their own psychologists. So they have a psychologist who conducts playtesting sessions, and developers are very aware about the psychological implications, and they have developed out of these theories, these are very basic, already completely new models like player types and so on. The problem is with player types is that player types change very often. So the thing is that player types, like these motivations, they're pretty universal. It might depend on the generation, like, you know, if we talk about Gen Z or Gen Y, there are different things that are more important to generations. But if you try to categorize player types, this is a temporary solution to attract players, because the player type can be invalid within a couple of years. But yeah, you can basically use these factors to create player types and find out basically what attracts them more. But yeah, these models also exist. Yes?
I would like to ask something, and forgive me, I don't want to be insulting.
Please be.
But you could do all your things in real world.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this is possible with other people interacting with them in whichever way you can imagine. So maybe fantasy world, but also this exists. You can go to Burning Man or do something like that. So would you say that people that choose to fulfill these desires by playing games on a computer or some kind of electronic device, that they are more likely than to also try to fulfill these desires in the real world, or they are less likely? Is this
Okay.
replacement? Is this fear? Or is this maybe a certain group of the population that feels more comfortable of living these motivations in games instead of real life?
Yeah, that's a very
The
interesting.
reason why I ask is, maybe it's because I'm getting old, but when I see young people, I sometimes do not understand how they interact,
Mm.
because it looks to me very different to at least what I imagined I was doing when I was their age.
Mm.
And I'm always thinking like, why are they like this? Because it's not necessarily that they, to me, feel like very satisfied
Mhm.
with the outcome. And I was just thinking, maybe it is because they are more used to gaming, which is like TV in terms of instead of conversation or
Mhm.
something like that. I don't want to talk bad about playing, but would
Oh,
you
that's-
say that
that's good.
players also learn something there that they then take
Mm.
into the real world?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's very good to be critical. Like, it's not like this session is not about like just affirming what I'm saying here, but about challenging that too. And you kind of also already answered that question yourself. It's like, so there are different. So maybe to start with the last thing that you mentioned, that people seem like less enjoying the interaction that they're having. I would just start off straight away is that communication is today profoundly different by the fact that communication happens on platforms that are owned by corporate bodies. So Facebook, Meta, and other conglomerates that basically they own the platforms where communication is happening. So they also streamline which forms of communication is going to happen on them. The thing with games, to the question whether people go out being more inclined to be then, okay, I also want to be like a strong barbarian like in World of Warcraft or fighter, or being less likely to do that because they're already fulfilling a desire there. This really depends on the person, right? It's just like, I just came off a phone call recently with a family member who asked me whether he should be afraid of his child turning into a school shooter for having started to play Fortnite. And the thing is that, the thing is that it really depends on the person. We all are individuals with predispositions. If we're inclined to be less social, being less likely to be involved with other people, basically being antisocial, games often seem like a last resort. There's an activity that you can do alone, and then usually we prescribe then, that person is like that because that person is playing games. But usually it often can go also the other way around. I personally think that games can inspire people to learn from these games. This is what I've been doing with the game-based learning approaches. Basically what we're doing here is also more or less play, right? We're interacting with each other. It's like a safe environment and so on. And hopefully some of you have learned something here today. But the thing is that this is like a game can only do as much as the game itself. The other factors, as when we talked about this loop between player and game, is also whether the player is, like, how engaged is the player in the fiction, in the mechanics. So it's like it's a very difficult thing to unwrap, and it's very dangerous to prescribe like generalist ideas on groups of people. So yes and no. It's a very difficult one, very good question, but yes, please. Do we still have time, or are we?
5-10 minutes is
okay.
Okay, don't worry, I'll stop after this question. If you look at this, if you're a game developer, you must look at the kind of clients you are having.
Mm-hmm.
Is it like the group that is targeted by games? Is that then a large group of society, or is this a small group, or is it depending on the age of the people you are targeting with the game?
So that really depends on the company, and it really depends on what kind of it really depends on the strategy of the developer. Like, if the developer intends to attract a larger audience, the goal will be to also attract traits, or to try to turn to a demography where many traits are shared by many people. The other question is that how does the game want to turn in a revenue, right? Because obviously children usually don't work, and they also don't have a credit card. They have parents that have these things, and this is why eventually games for children are designed in a way that seem less harmful. This could be a thing that is informing developers to develop specific aesthetics. But the other thing is that an interesting case study is the game Diablo Immortal, which was a game developed by the developers of World of Warcraft. And they developed it's like a role-play game for your mobile phone, but it's essentially is like after I think the first 10 or 15 hours of play, you cannot progress properly without paying. And the goal was of the developers, well, we don't know what their goal was, but it's pretty obvious, is to attract so-called whales. Whales are people that live probably maybe in the Arab Emirates and don't care if they spend $10,000 on virtual games. Could be wealthy people from any part of the world, but the game turned in the production cost within weeks because it targeted these people. It targeted a small group of wealthy people, and they succeeded in that. Other developers, they target a lot of people, and they have they expect to have like lower return on investment per person. So it really depends on, there are many ways that lead to Rome eventually, but it depends on. It really depends on. There are also developers out there who pretty much don't care and bring out games that sustain them as a company in a way, because they're catering to a specific target group, where it's not so much about money, but just sustaining the company as a project. This is what is a lot seen in the indie development scene, where it's not so much about doing billions, but kind of like covering your production costs and being able to pitch a next project. All right. So if there are no more questions, I will then just give it in for the bibliography, just in case, if there's only one book that you would buy, then it should be this one, Understanding Video Games. It is, if there's only one book you were allowed to buy and read, then it should be that about video games. If you want to connect, LinkedIn, if you're interested in what I actually did all of these years, you can find it on my website. And otherwise, thank you very much for joining today and participating here. It was a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
When is the next session?
In 2 months, I think, right? March?
In March.
In March, yeah.
Stay tuned. Definitely in March.
Okay, great. All right, that's it basically. So we can